world. In this final edition of The World for this year, we look back at a number of popular stories we have presented over the past 12 months, stories chosen not because they necessarily cover significant world events, but more because of the level of interest, discussion and emails that their broadcast raised. There were many hot topics: the continued Arab Spring and the repercussions, the continuing food crisis in Africa, conflict over Afghanistan, and the dramatic toppling of Colonel Gaddafi in Libya. There's been no shortage of news in 2011, and the humanitarian impact caused by world events remains inevitable. Let's take a look back.
This is The World with Tim Stackpool.
Recently, the Australian government has approved legislation that allows Australians to choose the gender they wish to be identified as, beyond simply male or female. It actually allows Australians who do not wish to identify themselves as either male or female, or who are transgender or intersex, to choose how they're identified on their passports. Richard Radcliffe is with the Human Rights Office in New York.
It's an interesting issue and one that's often overlooked, but it affects a relatively small but nevertheless significant number of people who feel themselves either to be neither male nor female. They may have been born with a condition known as intersex, which means that physically their physical characteristics are ambiguous and their gender is not easily established. Or they may be transgender. They may have been born with a male body but feel themselves to be inherently female, or vice versa. And these people have really been caught in legal limbo where they haven't been able to obtain official identity documents like a passport that properly reflect the way they express themselves in terms of their gender. And that creates all sorts of practical problems every time they try to apply for a job, or if they're applying for bank credit, or if they're trying to travel, buy an airline ticket, go through an airport. They encounter many, many practical barriers to the way they live their lives. The Australian decision means that they can very easily obtain a passport that reflects their preferred gender, male or female, or for those that want to identify as neither, they can now apply for a passport as indeterminate gender, X.
There must be a huge number of people who are affected by this problem. Is that the reason why the Australian government decided to take this action?
Yes, it didn't cost them very much simply to introduce a third gender on the passport application. In addition, though, there are two things that are significant about it. One is that people can choose now an indeterminate gender if they wish to, if they feel that properly reflects their own gender expression. But it also means it makes it much easier for transgender people who have transitioned from having been born biologically of one gender and are now living their lives as another gender. They can much more easily obtain a passport reflecting their new gender. Previously, and in many countries still today, they have to go through surgery or hormonal treatment, be sterilized, maybe even mandatory divorce if they happen to be married. Very onerous conditions which really make it very difficult for people to obtain proper official identity documents. The Australian decision makes that much easier as well.
Now, is Australia the only country to have done this?
No. In fact, it's quite new that countries are beginning to recognize that this is a problem, and also beginning to recognize that this is not just a policy challenge, but a human rights problem, because the people who are affected, they are facing these practical problems that prevent them getting healthcare, getting employment, getting into education. It's creating all sorts of barriers which prevent them from enjoying their human rights on an equal footing with everyone else.
So how does this work in Australia? Do you merely decide your gender and write that on a form without requiring any particular medical proof?
Well, more or less. They do require you to have a doctor's letter essentially supporting your gender choice. Unfortunately, I think in the wider community, perhaps misunderstand this issue and think that it's all about transsexuals who want to go through gender reassignment surgery. Well, sometimes it is, but sometimes it just isn't. The fact is that there are many people whose biological gender, the gender in their body, doesn't match the gender that they feel in themselves, in their brains and in their hearts. And they don't need to go through expensive, dangerous surgery, which may be prohibitively expensive, in fact, in many cases, in order to live their lives fully as the other gender.
Charles Radcliffe of the Human Rights Office in New York, talking about the new situation in Australia where more than the traditional male or female genders are now officially recognised. To Africa now, where steady progress is being made in fighting malaria. In that continent alone, malaria deaths have declined considerably, down by 33% in the past decade. This success is largely due to life-saving interventions such as insecticide-treated mosquito nets, indoor spraying, and effective and successful medication. Dr. Robert Newman of the World Health Organization spoke to Jerry Adams about what is being done to contain the deadly mosquito.
It's good news, and in a world starved for good news, this is a good news report. We still have a long way to go, and I don't want people to become overconfident from this report. However, it does show that these interventions do work, and that what stands between us and the global goals that have been set for malaria really is a question of adequate resources to scale up these proven interventions.
Can you talk about drug resistance? What is it and why does it happen?
Malaria is entirely preventable and treatable illness, but to treat malaria, you need to diagnose it with a diagnostic test and treat it with a medicine called an antimalarial medicine. And our most effective medicine is actually a combination of two types of medicines, and they're called ACTs, or artemisinin-based combination therapies. And these, over the past decade, have really improved treatment for people with malaria and have saved countless numbers of lives. Unfortunately, resistance to one of the components of these ACTs, the artemisinin component, which is the very powerful part that kills the parasites very quickly, has emerged on the border between Cambodia and Thailand several years ago. And WHO, working with a number of partners, including the governments of Cambodia and Thailand, with the Gates Foundation, with USAID, with Malaria Consortium and other partners, has been working to support the activities to contain this problem in the region where it's identified. On the other hand, this doesn't appear to be spreading very rapidly, and we have no evidence of this resistance to the artemisinins emerging in Africa to date.
So there are other ways that have been used to fight malaria, and one of them is mosquito-resistant insecticides. What's the latest on that?
The best way to prevent malaria, or to defeat malaria, is to prevent it in the first place. And so one of the ways that we do that is through vector control. So malaria is transmitted by mosquitoes, and so we can prevent mosquitoes from biting people and also kill mosquitoes through long-lasting insecticide-treated mosquito nets and by spraying the inside of houses. And that helps break the cycle of transmission and prevent people from getting malaria.
I guess it's even harder to eliminate the mosquito totally.
It is. Right now, many countries are in the phase of controlling malaria. When a country gets to the point of having no more malaria cases that are transmitted within its borders, in other words, you could still get a traveler coming back with malaria, but no malaria is transmitted within the country by local mosquitoes, that country has eliminated malaria and is certified by WHO as being malaria-free. And the ultimate goal, the global goal, which I think will take 40 years or more to achieve, is to eradicate malaria completely from the face of the earth. And that will take new tools to get us there.
And there's also been talk about a malaria vaccine. Is that possible in our lifetime?
In October of this year, we heard the preliminary results of a large phase 3 trial that's being conducted in 11 different sites in 7 different countries in Africa, enrolling more than 15,000 children. And those preliminary results confirmed the data that had been seen in previous trials, showing that this vaccine seems to prevent about 55% of clinical malaria in the first year after it's administered. And those are very encouraging results. We've never had a malaria vaccine get this far in development, and so people are excited.
This is The World with Tim Stackpool.
And in this special edition, we look back at some of the most popular reports broadcast on the program this year. The Palestinians' bid for recognition as a state by the United Nations has been described as risky and confrontational by the French government. Palestine applied for full membership to the UN in September, but the United States has said that it will use its veto in the UN Security Council to block the move. Now the French have said they will abstain from the vote because the bid has no chance of success. The US says Palestine and Israel need to come to a negotiated settlement on peace in the region and on the question of statehood. Jerry Adams spoke to Briou Pont, a delegate with France's mission to the UN.
Well, France announced yesterday at the meeting of the Security Council Standing Committee on Admissions that it would have no other option than to abstain on a resolution which would recommend full membership for Palestine. We are all well aware in the international community that the Palestinian request has no chance of success. in the Security Council, in particular because of the opposition expressed by one delegation, the United States, which have a power of veto. And on September 21, at the Ministerial Week here in New York, President Sarkozy warned the international community before the United Nations General Assembly of the risks of confrontation and deadlock that such an approach could create.
What other concerns does France have regarding Palestinian statehood at this time?
The reason for this announcement is that France believes that the Security Council track is risky, it is unnecessarily confrontational and counterproductive. We want to avoid the train wreck, and we support a more consensual approach. You know, France was not compelled to announce its position yesterday. It could have very well remained silent. But we wanted to send an early message to our Palestinian friends and tell them that they should choose another track, as the one they have chosen is doomed to failure. So France has assumed its responsibilities by proposing another approach, a realistic solution allowing Palestine's status to be elevated, to be upgraded to that of an observer state at the United Nations, in order to advance Palestine's international existence with a view towards a two-state solution. And we believe it would constitute an additional and remarkable step towards admission. We support the increasing existence of Palestine in international life. This is why, for instance, France supported Palestine's request for admission to UNESCO.
So the relationship between France and Palestine is a good one.
We have an excellent relationship. We are working hard for a global, just, sustainable solution for peace. And in this context, the legitimacy of the Palestinian aspiration for statehood is indisputable for France.
Still at the UN, and a group of experts there are warning about the alarming resurgence in the use of mercenaries, as well as the expansion of private military and security companies globally. The group is calling for the elimination of the use of mercenaries and for the international regulation of outsourcing security services. In Côte d'Ivoire and Libya, mercenaries were reportedly responsible for gross human rights violations. Meanwhile, in Iraq, contractors for military and security companies have also been accused of committing abuses. Or so says Faiza Patel, who heads the UN group. She's speaking with Jocelyn Sambira.
Obviously, Iraq is where, the issue of private military companies really came to the center of international attention, particularly with the 2007 incident in Nusur Square in Baghdad, where employees of Blackwater, a U.S. military contractor, allegedly shot and killed 17 civilians. So in Iraq, we were looking at how the Iraqi government is now dealing with this issue. Until quite recently, 2009, the Coalition Provisional Authority, which ran Iraq, had issued immunity for all military contractors operating there. That was reversed in 2009, but there's still quite a lack of clarity about how the current status is of these contractors. And for any events that happened prior to 2009, it has not been possible for the government to bring any prosecutions in Iraqi courts, and prosecutions in U.S. courts have also been problematic. So the Nusur Square case, which is the most famous incident, is still pending now 4 years after the incident in U.S. courts.
Has there been any improvement in terms of the way these companies behave because of the scrutiny?
Well, in some ways, in particular situations, we have seen that the incidents that happened, particularly in Iraq and Afghanistan, have led some countries to tighten their regulations. So the United States government, for example, has significantly tightened its control over contractors. And obviously, if they're better controlled, they're less likely to commit abuses. And this has been particularly true of the Department of Defense contractors. With respect to other contractors hired by the U.S., for example, the Department of State, USAID, there's a number of agencies that use them. The mechanisms for control are not as tight as they are for the Defense Department. In Iraq as well, the country itself has taken charge of the situation, and the Ministry of Interior there has been quite vigilant in looking after contractors. So there's been pockets of improvement, but on an overall basis, there hasn't really been an overall convention or new legislation in a number of countries to control these companies.
What about these states that don't necessarily regulate?
There's a great unevenness in the national legislation on this issue. Many countries don't have legislation on this issue because it's a relatively new phenomena. And you have to also think about the fact that there are at least 3 categories of countries that need legislation. So you need legislation in the country where the company is registered, which is primarily in the US, the UK, Western Europe. That's where most of these countries are headquartered. You need legislation in the countries where these companies operate. So Afghanistan, Iraq has to have its own national legislation. And thirdly, you need legislation in countries like Uganda, where people are recruited from. And you have large contingents of Ugandans working for PMSCs. So you need a lot of legislation, and you don't actually have very much at this point.
So today in New York, what is your main message?
My main message is that when we say mercenary, it sounds almost old-fashioned, something that we think about in the 1970s, but it's very much a real phenomenon today. And when you look at the situation in Côte d'Ivoire and you look at the situation in Libya, you see that, particularly on the African continent, mercenaries are very much an issue. My second message would be that private military and security companies, because of the nature of their activities, continue to pose pretty serious risks to human rights, and so we need to be vigilant and make sure that they're really properly regulated, both at the national level and internationally.
Jocelyn Sambira reporting. In today's digital world, new data is being generated by just about everything we do. Calling a friend, making a purchase, using the internet to access information. They all leave a digital trail. A new initiative seeks to analyse such data to get a better understanding of changes in human well-being. Zazie Schaefer, the Deputy Director of the Global Pulse Project, says such information can assist with economic crises or disaster management.
What we believe in the longer term, this project can make a major contribution to making development more agile. We've seen, this environment we are living in at the moment is much more volatile than many years ago. We see many more crises happening, and they're much more contagious than in probably 10 years ago. So we believe that development has become much more agile, much more responsive. And we believe that Global Pulse and this new data can help us become much more agile.
We have seen many advancements over the past few years. What are some of the technologies that you are working with?
What policymakers need in a crisis situation to protect the most vulnerable populations in their countries is real-time data. It's not so much about the technologies, it's more about how these technologies kind of generate this new type of data.
So how is it, though, that you use this data to solve problems that people face?
What we are really looking at is how policymakers can better protect vulnerable populations when, for example, a global economic crisis hits. Now, one of the main tools that policymakers have are social protection programs. There have been many studies that, for example, mobile phone calling patterns can give you a sense of changes in people's economic status. They can give you a sense of people moving, for example, from urban areas to rural areas or the other way around. So this is very important information for policymakers.
What about the concerns that people have about privacy, about the information you gather, about perhaps the phone calls they make or the other info that you mentioned?
Yeah, one of the key principles of this project is the protection of individuals' privacy and the protection of national sovereignty as well. There's a lot of data that governments cannot share publicly, so it's extremely important to be very sensitive or very attuned to how to use this data. None of the data that this project will be accessing can be traced back to individuals. It will all be aggregated and anonymized data, and that is extremely important.
Zazie Schaefer from the Global Pulse Project there, talking about how aggregated information gained via technology can be used on a national or international scale when a crisis hits.
This is The World with Tim Stackpool.
And in this special edition, we look back at some of the most popular reports broadcast on the program this year. To the US now, where the events of 9/11 still reflect on the national psyche and present challenges for Americans who have converted to Islam since that fateful day in 2001. Prejudice, vilification and outright discrimination is felt by the converts, not just from non-Muslims, but also from those who share their faith. Al Jazeera's Rob Reynolds reports from California.
Being Muslim in post-9/11 America isn't always easy. It's especially challenging for Americans who have converted to Islam. They face puzzled family and friends and sometimes hostile responses from their communities. Todd Gallinger is a California attorney and recent convert. Family members accepted his choice, but his marriage broke up and friends stopped calling.
I've actually received death threats and had people call me a terrorist or a terrorist lawyer.
The harshest response came when he ran for local office.
They actually sent out a mailer that had a picture of a Hamas rally on it with a guy wearing a keffiyeh shooting an AK-47 into the air, and that associating that with me with my picture on there too.
According to the Pew Research Center, 20% of Muslims in the U.S. say they are converts.
It's estimated that nationwide about 20,000 Americans convert to Islam every year.
For Chantel Cummings, Islam lay at the end of a long spiritual journey.
I was just aggressively seeking any kind of knowledge that I could. When I got my English translation of the Quran and I started reading it, it was amazing. I just thought, wow, this is how I feel and how I think and how I want my life.
The divorced mother of two says she has also gotten dirty looks and hurtful comments since her conversion, but says most people are simply curious.
I try very hard to give a really positive impression. I'm not out to convert anybody, but I really like to help people that have the wrong information.
Many converts say they even face suspicion from other Muslims, some of whom suggest they may be spying for the authorities. Still, for converts like Roy Bradshaw, who grew up in a conservative Christian household, this deeply personal decision has provided the peace of mind that eluded him for a lifetime.
I think in my heart I've always been a Muslim. I think my fitra inside my heart, the things that drive me were Islamic from the beginning.
Rob Reynolds, Al Jazeera, Mission Viejo, California.
An estimated 1 billion people, that's a seventh of the world's population, have been on the move this year. That's according to an annual report by the International Organization for Migration. But unfortunately, an increasing number of these migrants are being forced to use illegal methods to migrate. Because of stricter border control, many end up in the hands of people traffickers. Jerome Longy asked the IOM Director General William Swing why migrants are finding it more difficult to travel.
We have a kind of a paradoxical situation in the migrant world today. First of all, there are more people on the move than at any other time in recorded history. About 215 million international and 740 million domestic migrants moving within their own territory. So it means, given the current count of 7 billion people in the world, about 1 out of every 7 people is on the move. Now, numerically, that's more than any other time, although percentage-wise it's still about 3%. So you would think at a time like this that migration would be something that is very welcome. And in point of fact, the cruel irony is that more and more governments are turning inward. Borders are being closed, visa regimes are being tightened, and there's less and less opportunity for migration to occur on a legal basis. So a lot of people are being pushed into the hands of traffickers. We at IOM believe that a major part of the problem is miscommunication or non-communication about the contributions that migrants make. So this is the purpose for our 60th anniversary edition of the World Migration Report, to talk about how do we communicate about migration and migrants.
So the report calls for public discussion. What do you mean by public discussion?
Well, several things. First of all, we think that governments need to show the political courage to explain to the population why in today's world, when you have an aging, developed world and a youthful, developing world, the push-pull factors are clear. Why are we not explaining that to our public so they accept it? And one of the important points here is that the very composition and nature of the nation state is now changing before our eyes, but we are not doing an adequate job, including my organization, of explaining the inevitability of large-scale migration, the importance of preparing for it, and the desirability of it.
So is it a call for responsibility or a call for help?
I'm talking about sharing responsibility together, to talk about the reality of migration as a necessary and inevitable part of today's life, and the desirability of it if we learn to manage it properly. Part of the problem is finding a formula whereby people understand that national sovereignty is respected as to who enters a country. At the same time, we respect individual rights, including the oldest poverty reduction strategy, which is to move when one has the need to move.
Do you think that the media are not doing enough today regarding migration?
I think we have a responsibility to do a better job of informing the media so that they have the full story. It's obviously very dramatic when you have a boat of irregular migrants arrive somewhere. That is the headline story. It's much more difficult to make headlines out of migrants who are contributing, for example, and are probably paying as much in taxes as they're sending home in remittances. That's not an interesting story, and we have to find a way to help the media to give the full story and get rid of the stereotypes. Today, we live in a digital world. It's a digital revolution. You have now, in contrast to the year 2000, you had 390 million people connected to the internet. Today, it's approaching 2 billion. You've got probably 250 billion emails sent on a regular basis. You have, 800 million subscribers to Facebook and a similar amount to Twitter. So obviously they have a major role to play, and we have to find a way to give them the fuller picture.
That's William Swing, head of the International Organization for Migration. And that is a retrospective view of the world for this week, and indeed our final edition for the year. Many thanks to you for listening and joining in the online discussions, and you can always keep in touch via our website, www.theworldradioshow.com, where you'll also find a link to our Facebook page. Whether you listen on air, online or via the podcast, your support and comments are always appreciated, as the world is committed to bringing you stories that affect the people of our planet, either on a mass or individual scale. And we always hope to do so with balance and integrity. The program is produced and compiled by Tim Stackpool, and I look forward to your company in the new year. Until then, bye for now.